Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. 2 weeks to the day until the Dutch Grand Prix. Red Bull have decided that Sergio Perez will stay after the summer break, but it doesn't sound like they're all that convinced it's actually the right decision. One of their chief engineers talking about the delta that Perez has to Max Verstappen, and if these numbers are actually true, surely there's no way that he can keep this seat too much longer. Very much interested in your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Firstly, on the Audi side, a bit of driver market update here really. Nico Hülkenberg, of course, is signed with Sauber. They're going to become Audi, and he basically says, like, they signed me over guys with wins, guys with better stats. That says something about my performance, which I think is fair. Hülkenberg has been great for Haas over the last couple of years, but his teammate, we don't really know who that is actually going to be. No clear favourite is the current understanding for who his teammate is going to be. There are a few options, including, I would say, Perez is not entirely impossible. If Perez was to be dropped by Red Bull, you know, you've got to look at the seats available and say, realistically, the only one would be to go to Audi Sauber, and that might even make a bit of sense. I don't necessarily like it, but they might at least consider the possibility if Perez was to go now. The issue for Perez is possibly if they don't get rid of him now, but instead they get rid of him in a few rounds' time, which I don't think is impossible based on what we have discussed over the last few weeks and what we are about to discuss in the coming minutes. The only other seat is at RB, but RB, you know, they're not taking Perez. It don't make any sense for him to go to the sister team given the circumstances because they want to put Lawson in the car. So that's maybe something to consider. Bottas is probably the driver that I would like to keep the seat because I think he deserves a seat in Formula 1, and as I say, realistically, that's the only option as it presently stands. The interesting couple of names, though, that are emerging. Firstly, Gabriele Bortoleto. We talked about him over the last few days. Definitely a promising talent who should be in and around the conversation. To me, he wouldn't have been at the top of the list just because you've got, you know, guys like Teo Pourchaire who are linked with Sauber and won Formula 2, but yet he doesn't seem like he's going to get anywhere. Or, you know, Zay Maloney, there's other top drivers they could consider, but Bortoleto's in and around the conversation. The other very interesting name to me especially is Alex Palou, IndyCar champion, and just a really impressive overall well-rounded driver who has honestly been phenomenal in IndyCar over the last couple of years. Given how difficult it is to win IndyCar by a substantial margin, Palou has done that emphatically and won so many races in the process. So Palou was linked to Formula 1 briefly around kind of, you know, we heard about these rumours. Obviously, he's, you know, had drama with McLaren over in IndyCar. We heard about the Colton Herta stuff a couple of years ago now, linked to AlphaTauri at the time, didn't have the super license. You know, Palou could come over if he was to get an offer. I think that he was linked maybe to Williams not that long ago either. So I think Palou might have thought that he's missed the boat somewhat on this, and there might be some sort of contractual related stuff, but I will say that it doesn't surprise me that Audi have Palou on their radar, and I actually think that's a very exciting possibility as well. So everything that they do as their driver option, my preference is Bottas, but it is kind of like the boring option. If they put Palou or Bortoleto in the car, you know, we could have some fireworks in our hands, and that sounds pretty exciting, especially because Bortoleto, he ain't afraid to speak his mind. I saw this quote today, and it's funny that, you know, McLaren Jr. Gabriele Bortoleto on Sergio Perez, with the results he's having, he's out, which is funny, right? Because, you know, you've got to be relatively notable for your quotes to start appearing in the media, and now that Bortoleto's getting linked to Formula 1 teams such as Audi, we're now seeing his quotes come around the media, and the guy does speak his mind, whether you think it's fair or not. Like, it is pretty funny, isn't it? Saying that, you know, this guy, obviously someone who's won many races in Formula 1 and is, you know, part of a Constructors' Championship wins, this type of stuff, is saying, yeah, this Perez guy, with the result he's having, this guy's pretty bad. He's going to be out of the sport. So he's not wrong, but I just thought it was pretty funny. And it might be one of those quotes that, let's say Bortoleto does get a Formula 1 seat. Is this the type of quote that is going to, like, come back to bite him in the coming years? Maybe. I don't know. Intriguing your perspective in the comments below. Before we get into the Perez stuff in more detail, though, this is a rather remarkable story today from Oscar Piastri. Now, they've talked about, I think even Webber was talking about him being in a strong place for the second half of the season, and in more ways than one potentially, because a few days ago, I think this was actually after maybe the Spa Grand Prix, they were commenting, Lando and Oscar, on their plans for the summer break, and it was pretty interesting to hear Oscar say that I've been slightly broken for the last few weeks. And nobody really knew what he meant at the time, and this video was uploaded about 11 days ago onto YouTube here. However, today he said the following: first part of the season, done. First Grand Prix victory, first broken bone. Rib is enjoying the break. Now, this was not known about until Piastri put this out, and we can actually see the full image right here. Oscar Piastri, date that this was taken on the 8th of July. So this is UK way around, so for those in the US, because Oscar's birthday is the 6th of April rather than the 4th of June. So this is done as 6th of the month, and then therefore this will be 8th of the month. So this was not on the 7th of August, as in a couple of days ago. This was actually last month on the 8th of July, if I'm understanding correctly anyway. And we can see a rib fracture on his 6th rib on the left-hand side. So pretty remarkable stuff here. And there's been, people wondering why, because that was 2 weeks before his first Grand Prix win in Hungary. That's, because as we say, he won that a couple of weeks later towards the end of July. This was around about the Silverstone Grand Prix weekend, was it not? So the understanding is that he picked up this injury during or around the time of the Austrian Grand Prix. Now, we don't exactly know how or when or why or whatever, but Piastri did, it seems, a number of races literally with a fractured rib. So it can't have been affecting him too much, otherwise he would have talked about it, you would think, to the media. Although you could argue the other point is that the drivers often don't like to say much about this if there's any way that the governing body might say, hey, we don't think you're fit to race. Because these drivers on some level are all kind of maniacs, right? They're driving cars that go 300 kilometers an hour round corners. Like, it is bonkers. You've got to be a little bit insane if you want to drive in this sport and many other motorsports like it. So with that in mind, the drivers want to drive at all costs. I mean, Carlos Sainz would not have had his appendix, he would have raced if he could, you know what I mean? And you'll often see the drivers pushing through those barriers, such as we saw in Qatar last year, when Lance Stroll is saying, I was literally passing out through corners because of the heat, but I didn't want to pull over and retire. Sargent was the one that did, but I think he was already unwell, Logan, going into the weekends. If Sargent had been fully healthy, he'd have done the same thing, and I'm pretty sure he would have done anyway, and powered through and just, put his life at risk because, they want to drive the cars as fast as possible. So Piastri would not have wanted to not race, even knowing, as of the 8th of July, that he had this broken rib. So it's interesting that it's coming out now it's healed, right? Because nobody mentioned it at the time, and it's kind of the same story maybe when Verstappen was saying recently how after his 51G crash at Silverstone in 2021, he actually had blurred vision, effectively had concussion symptoms over the upcoming rounds. He said at the Austin Grand Prix that year it was really affecting him, but still, he was deemed fit to race. And that's one of the interesting parts, isn't it? That Verstappen was not mentioning that at the time because maybe, the governing body, the Formula One, would have deemed him unfit to race. But Verstappen maybe kept that card close to his chest, was deemed fit to race. And seemingly the same thing with Piastri. So it must have been affecting him to some degree. Obviously, even during that Hungarian Grand Prix, he went off track, didn't he, towards the end of the lap, and maybe a couple of uncharacteristic mistakes from Piastri that weekend. So maybe and obviously was still very fast and won the Grand Prix, controversially, but won the Grand Prix. So maybe there was something in that. But it's pretty impressive stuff. I don't know whether Planet F1 sources are correct on when he picked up this injury or whatever, and how he did this injury, who really knows. But he did have an injury, that's now been confirmed, and it's now healed. So he's happy to talk about it, I suppose. Otherwise, there would have been questions as to whether or not he should have been racing, I imagine. But definitely intrigued to your thoughts on that in the comments section below. McLaren as well, they're looking pretty good. They got the 1-2 in Hungary. The issue is more so behind the scenes stuff, not behind the scenes precisely, but off-track stuff, decision-making, strategy, operations, and also just execution from Norris hasn't been up to scratch over the last few rounds, and he knows that himself. But speaking of this Perez stuff, we've got to ask the question again on driving styles and which driving styles these cars, or especially the Red Bull cars, tend to favour, because Verstappen likes his cars very on the nose, and there are very few drivers in the world that could handle that. It's the same reason why many will say, and probably for good reason, if Hamilton went to join Red Bull in 2021, Verstappen would have won the championship, but probably also the other way around, because Hamilton in a Red Bull in a Verstappen designed and made up Red Bull will not be as potent as Verstappen in his own car, the same way the other way around. Hamilton doesn't like the car so much on the nose, liking a lot of rear grip in his machinery, and Verstappen would likely struggle more to deal with that. And Hamilton was even talking about this over the last few weeks, about the tyres in this era of regulations don't seem to like his driving style over a single lap. He actually said, because Hamilton's qualifying pace has been surprisingly poor, really, compared to, look, Russell is great. I think everyone really respects Russell's quali pace, but you'd have expected Hamilton to be tied with Russell at least this season in quali, but Russell has a quite substantial advantage, and Hamilton said that he's, believes that he's been not good in qualifying for quite a while. Sometimes he gets it. So the question is he like washed up and his quali pace is never going to be the same again? But it doesn't seem like his race pace has really lost anything compared to a couple of years ago. So, you can argue that probably his quali pace is still there as well. It might just be something to do with the setup of the cars, and there's been some discussion from Mercedes and from Hamilton on that the tyres in this set of regulations don't tend to suit his driving style over a single lap. The car's more of a knife edge than ever. It doesn't like it when you brake late and deep, which is what Hamilton likes to do. You have to brake early and run off and roll the speed in. I hate that. That's just not me. So interesting to hear that seems like these tyres, in a race, that's fine. That's kind of what you do. But in a quali situation, Hamilton's style is braking as late as possible. That's what he's been famous for, really, ever since his early days. But these tyres, it seems, the current Pirelli spec in qualifying, don't really like that so much. So interesting to hear about, to be fair. And Hamilton was talking about the way that he's adapting his driving style now to become more competitive. Who knows what things are going to be like in 2026? And as Hamilton says, ultimately, as a driver, you've got to be adaptive and be able to, okay, this isn't perfect for me, but I've got to make the most of it that I actually can. Ultimately, as drivers, you should be able to drive everything, and I think we can. It's just in certain situations, some drivers are able to deal with things better than others. It takes some people a short time and others longer to adapt. So pretty interesting to hear, and maybe Hamilton feels like he's found his way to adapt now, and therefore he's going to be more potent in the second half of this season. Whether that's true for Sergio Perez is another question, because his driving style, again, he likes 90-degree corners. He likes a lot of rear grip and, picking up grip. This is why he's pretty good at street circuits, is you get a lot of 90-degree corners, you get a lot of acceleration zones where rear stability is quite important. Checo prefers his cars like that. Max doesn't. Max just wants to throw the front end in and figure out the problems later. That doesn't work for most drivers. Even drivers like Charles Leclerc, that like the car to be on the nose and having, oversteer rather than understeer. Even, Alex Albon is another driver who's similar-ish, but Verstappen is to an extreme level. And that means that when you design a car for Verstappen, in Verstappen's preferences, because he's the number one driver, it makes things challenging for his, compatriot in the car, especially for someone that actually doesn't have that style in the first place. So this is why Washay's talking about the drivability of the car and the upgrades have hurt Perez to some degree, but obviously it's not just about the car, it's also about the performance of the driver in the car. So Paul Monahan, we talked about some of his quotes yesterday on the state of Red Bull, missing Adrian Newey because he can solve all the problems and this type of stuff. He was also commenting on Max's tone, right? Let's not forget what happened during the Hungarian Grand Prix, and he says Max has set a pretty high bar for himself as well as us. Last year and races this year, he's reached a level that others have thus far yet to match, and as such, if he feels like we are not attaining that high bar, we can expect those type of comments. I don't have a strong view on how he presents it to us, whether the tone is pleasant or unpleasant. Look at it as if he is sensing that we are not getting the most out of ourselves as a team. If he didn't say anything, would it push us to do anything differently? Maybe, maybe not. So his point is that what Verstappen is saying is true and fair. The way he says it is a matter for debate, but it's not like he's saying, oh, Verstappen, like, Max, calm it down with your criticism of the team, because you want to be as effective a team as possible. The other words, though, that he said were on Sergio Perez, and it's kind of, he was pretty honest and open in this interview in general, and certainly these words I thought, even as he says, I don't want to be rude to Checo, and he could very well take my head off if he was sitting here, but I would say in general, Max is a little quicker than him. I mean, everyone knows that. But this was kind of the pretty damning argument, I guess you could say. Let's say a circuit has 20 corners, the difference per corner is very small. Maybe Verstappen gains half a tenth per corner, which adds up over the lap. He gets to the limit, he stays a bit closer to it, it doesn't go too far over it in qualifying when he overdoes it, and the average will show up as a number eventually, he says. So obviously saying, look, Perez is pretty good, but he's no Verstappen, and talking about how the car is competitive, but other cars have caught up, etc., etc. This, though, was the interesting part, saying how Verstappen is half a tenth per corner faster. Interesting way to analyze, right? Because we often talk about lap time delta, right? We talk about this driver is, 2/10 a lap or 3/10 a lap faster than their kind of teammate, as it were. But some laps are longer than others, right? And this is why a 2/10 gap around Austria is probably near enough equivalent to like, a 3.5, 4/10 gap around something like Spa, because it's a much longer track. Now, to be fair, some of the track is a straight, and on a straight, you just put your foot down, right? There's no real skill. There's always a bit of skill in fast corners, because let's say you're flat round a corner, drivers that are able to make the least corrections possible scrub off the least speed, and therefore they can maintain a higher average speed. And also, if you can accelerate out of a corner faster, you're going to gain time all the way down the straight. So just because it's a straight line doesn't necessarily mean that Max and Checo are the same speeds on the straight, because it also depends how they exited the previous corner. And Max actually generally, although he can be good on the brakes if necessary, will brake earlier than others and will carry more speed out the corner and will therefore gain time on the straights compared to Perez, generally speaking. But I just thought this overall comment on half a tenth per corner was quite the statement, because most tracks have something like 15, potentially 20 corners. So half a tenth per corner over 20 corners is literally a second, right? I mean, that's half a tenth, so 0.05 times by 20, that's a second. So it's probably not quite half a tenth a corner, but it also explains why at circuits like Monza, for example, Perez will not have as much of a gap usually to Verstappen than at maybe other circuits, which are longer and also not street tracks, because something like Singapore and Baku, Perez's style suits that type of circuit more than it suits Verstappen. Max is still probably going to be faster, but it lowers the gap somewhat. But on a normal, traditional track like Monza, Perez is probably going to be closer to Max than he would otherwise be, just because there were fewer corners at Monza. There aren't really very many at all compared to what you'd see on other circuits. So that's maybe one way to look at it. But if this data and this kind of feeling from Red Bull is true, and even let's say it's a quarter of a tenth per corner, over 20 corners, that's still half a second. And especially when Verstappen is not the fastest car by half a second, because last year, generally speaking, Max would be half a second a lap up the road, and Perez would be fighting for second, third, around about that, because every other car was half a second a lap slower than the Red Bull with Max at the wheel. But this year, let's say Max is still half a second a lap faster than Perez, or even a second a lap faster if you want to read into Monahan's statements to that actual extreme. Although I imagine after he said that, he did the calculation and thought, hang on a second, I've kind of, sold Perez down the rear in a way, like I've made him sound worse than he is. But whatever you say on that, Max is now, let's say, on the pace of the leaders in qualifying. He's pretty much around about there. But if Perez is half a second off that, that's P8, right? Maybe worse than P8 when you add up all the numbers you consider the competition that we currently have. So that's why there are questions on Perez's future still, even though they've maintained him for now. The question is it really for now? And this is what the race and others have been arguing, that there's a good argument to make that, sure, Perez keeps his seat for after the summer break, but does he keep it too much longer than that? With the words of Christian Horner saying that they look forward to seeing Checo race on tracks that he's been good at before, there's all sorts of stuff happening. But Ricciardo versus Tsunoda, this is the current battle of the season. Ricciardo's done better over the last few rounds, but still, you've got to think that Tsunoda's the man who's been more impressive overall, but he's not going to be the one getting the seat if Perez goes, as far as we understand. So hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.